Hello, and welcome to Future Rising, a special Girl Rising Earth Day event. I'm Christina Lowry, CEO of Girl Rising, a nonprofit organization working in 11 countries to change the way the world values girls and advance girls' right to a quality education. We're so happy to have you here today as we continue to celebrate Earth Day and the role girls can play in one of the most pressing issues of our time, climate change. Today, you will hear from three inspiring young climate activists who are doing just that, using their education to fight for a better future for all of us. And a little later, I'll be back with Christina Kwauk, one of the world's leading experts on the interlinkages between girls' education and climate change. And with that, I'll hand it over to Maya, Xiye, Ridhima, and Ellyanne.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here today with Ellyanne, a true environmental warrior, alongside Xiye and Ridhima, two more incredible climate activists who we will meet in just a moment. My name is Maya Angulo, and I am a member of Girl Rising's Young Leaders Task Force. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today as we celebrate Earth Day and the power of girls' education to fight climate change and its effects. I'm so honored to be here with these three inspiring young women who are speaking out and taking action for environmental justice. Start with Ridhima and get into some of the meat of our conversation today. So you are 13 years old and you've already done so much to fight for the environment, including calling out what you've called the blame game that occurs during many of these global discussions and conversations. And you call for real, tangible action that the people on the ground can feel. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work as a climate activist?
Like, I started my activism in 2017. So it's like I filed a lawsuit, petition against the government of India due to their inaction to tackle climate change and, not following the rules and norms that we have on ground, the work going on paper. So it was dismissed by the National Green Tribunal, which is a green court here. But I've taken it to the Supreme Court here, which is one of the biggest court. If it get dismissed from there, then I can't really take it forward, so I'm hoping my best that, I get justice. So it's been going on since 2017. It's still pending there at the Supreme Court, but yes, that it will get heard. And rather than that, in 2019, I filed a lawsuit at United Nations and a child rights committee with 15 other child petitioners, including Greta Thunberg, and we did that lawsuit basically to protect rights of kids all around the world. And yeah, I've been working on different issues that are in my country, like air pollution, water pollution, and all.
So incredible. And I love how you bring up seeking justice and taking action and speaking up, all of these work that you're doing. And so I'd like to turn to Xiye now. Sparked your interest in climate change and what motivates your activism?
All of us go through that the issues that we care about. It's not only one or two things. Why haven't I seen this before? It's a process of learning and then also a process of knowing. And for me, I was raised in indigenous community in Mexico. And so I grew up with this thinking and philosophy of taking care of Mother Earth, this reciprocity, this cultural connection. And when I grew up and I saw that this relationship was being disrespected by pollution, by extraction, by extractivism, by people profiting off of hurting our communities, that's when my bubble burst. That's when I was like, why isn't everyone doing things to help Mother Earth rather than hurt it? In 2015, my hometown suffered from flooding. And that's when I realized not only that the climate crisis is already happening, not in 50 or 100 years, but also it's affecting frontline communities the most, and the communities who are the least able to build back better, to have resources to thrive after a natural disaster. And so, all of these things combined kind of drove me into my activism. And as all of us, I always ask myself, like, where can I start? And I think that the best place to start is in your community, a place where you think you can make a difference. So I personally started in my environmental club in high school, but it was very much geared towards like little challenges, like be vegan for a day, or bring your own cup today. And coming from Mexico, I saw the power that New York City had as an influencer of policy and change. So I was like, if I'm in New York, I'm going to make sure that I harness that power. And so I started organizing my environmental club to go lobby to our state capital, testify at City Hall for the declaration of a climate emergency. And that just didn't really work either, because, there's organizations that have been doing this for decades, have been demanding climate justice for decades, and the government is still not listening. So that's when Greta Thunberg called for the first ever global climate strike. And I thought to myself, if we as youth disrupt our civil duty, which is going to school, because we cannot take any more of the fossil fuel industry, they have to pay attention to us. And that's when I organized the first ever global climate strike at my school, getting 600 of my classmates to walk out. And I always say, that's 600 more people than I thought would walk out. And, after that, the rest is history. Fridays for Future NYC was born. We organized several strikes afterwards that brought over 300,000 people to the streets, which is the strike that Ridhima was at in New York City. And, ever since, just like I see the youth climate movement growing and becoming stronger and more passionate. So that's my story, and why I care so much about it's ultimately about preserving joy for our communities and future generations.
Yeah, especially preserving joy and keeping the future available for next generations. I love how you bring up this process of learning that happened as you began your journey of activism and growth. And so, Ellyanne, I would love to know why you decided to focus on planting trees and kind of where you started with all of this.
Started planting trees when I was 4 years old. It's ever since I went home after school, and I told my mom, and I really annoyed her. I wanted to plant many trees. I wanted to plant as many trees as I could. Yeah, so she really felt annoyed with me. She was like, no, tree planting is not a career. You're not going to get anywhere. Nothing's going to happen. You should either just do something else, like maybe become a president or something. But I was like, no, I want to do what I want to do. So I really pestered her, and then she gave me this orange seed. But one thing is very weird. That orange seed, when we planted it, it didn't end up smelling like oranges. It ended up smelling like lemons, which was one thing I'm still confused with today, even though I've had so much learning from it.
I like how you talk about how it starts with one seed. You talk about the orange tree that kind of smells like a lemon, and it's a little confusing. Don't really know where it's going. I think a lot of times we envision education to be like the starting seed of a lot of people's journey towards activism, towards future careers. And so I was wondering if we could each talk about a little bit about the education experience and how it has supported your climate activism and your ability to lead and influence. And let's go ahead and start with Xiye.
Definitely, we are lacking climate education all over the world. And not only climate education, but a lot of the times just good education that's true. I'm still learning things in school that, talk about indigenous peoples being ancient when, they're still here. And, just we're learning about that Eurocentric view of the world that is about imperialism and colonialism, and countries want money and power and they're willing to go to war to get it. All of these views are harmful for us if we're learning that in school, because then we think that that's the norm. And the norm is not individualism. The norm should be cooperation. The norm should be, constructing a better world for all of us. And so I think that the education system needs to be reformed completely, not only to include climate science and the facts about what we need to do in terms of climate solutions, but also the whole narrative around what our purpose as humans on Earth is, because it is not infinite economic growth, because that is just simply not sustainable. And, you know, even right now I'm in college and I'm able to choose my own classes, which is something that is really exciting. And I've chosen a lot of climate related classes: physics of global warming, you know, environmental economics, sustainable development in Latin America. And all these classes have really opened my eyes to the intersectionality of the climate crisis, how it is about the physics solution and the science and women's rights and indigenous people's rights.
Amazing. I think, yeah, especially I love how you bring up moving beyond individualism towards cooperation. And I think it's gonna be really interesting to hear from Ridhima and Ellyanne, who are a bit younger, about their educational experiences as well. It's great that we have these different generations to see perhaps some of the similarities and differences in your experiences. So let's go over to Ridhima. Can you talk a little bit about your education experience?
I would say I totally, I totally agree with Xiye, because that's what has been, things are pretty much, more bad in our country. Because, what happens is we have, in our textbooks and stuff, we learn that, it's really important to, have children learn that, you can't really sustain without environment, you can't really sustain without this whole biodiversity on this planet, which is somewhere, is really very lacking. I still remember, one day we were, when I started learning. So it's like, for me, I would say it was totally, I never really got any answer from my teachers. Most of the time they were like, they were so busy that they didn't answer me. Most of the time they were like, we don't know it, just focus on your studies and stuff like that, so it was really disheartening, to be honest. And it was just, the total thing was I learned it on my own. My parents helped me out, and I'm thankful that my parents have been working in this field, because if they were not, they might not know that much as they did, and they won't be able to explain me each and everything, and they won't be able to clear each and every doubt of mine. So, and not everyone's parents have been working on wildlife conservation or on forest conservation. So it's really important for the education system, to teach children about loving the environment.
Do you have for young people out there who want to take action for the environment but don't know where to start?
See, it's like it could be really difficult, as she said, you would be feeling like you are the only one, taking action. And that was one of the biggest challenges that I faced in 2017, because, I didn't even had, Greta to be one of my inspiration, at that time. So I was so stressed out, and most of the time, and my friends at that time, didn't even thought about this thing. They didn't even give one thought to this thing. So even when I talked to them about, this is what's been happening during our recess and lunch break, they were like, let's change the topic. There's so many things, So some of them are in dance, some of them are in music and sports. So they used to love talking about that. And I used to feel a lot left out, because, somewhere my interest was a little different from them. And most of the time I felt like, am I the only one, trying to bring out a change? Or, is there something wrong with them, with me, that
Small actions do count, and they do matter, and they're the foundation of the activist spirit, I think. Is there any advice that you might have for people interested?
Well, one advice that I have is to really recognize that we don't need 1,000 perfect activists. We need millions of people doing their best. Skill is you can use it to be part of the solution, whether that be coding or, food justice, and anything that you can do. It can be because of how many sectors climate change affects. So that's my advice. There's really a world of possibilities when it comes to climate solutions, and all of us can be part of that.
So now I'd like to open up the floor and see if any of you have questions for each other.
I'll ask Ellyanne, and both of you guys, Ridhima and Ellyanne, what is your biggest dream for 2030? Where do you want the world to be?
I just really feel like if Kenya and if other places are the green city under the sun, it's just gonna make a change. No matter how many trees you plant, like if you plant let's say, a tomato bush, or just plant anything that you can that you think can make a change to what you've done. Because with all your progress, I don't think any of us would be able to live without other people helping other people, because I think that's how the world is meant to go. You know, sharing is caring. Yeah.
Perfect. A vision of caring and a vision of trees and greenery. Ridhima, what about your 2030 vision?
In general, my country in specific, all around the world, they've been so much praised for, having their, sort of, meeting up their NDCs, before time, and, doing a great job at. So for my government, specifically, everything has been running on paper, and, there's nothing that's been going on, the best. I do feel that, I would be able to, have all the indices that they have. I really hope that I will be able to make them for those on ground in specific. And I hope that I could have more and more kids join our movement till 2030. And I really hope that we'll be able to, restore, our whole ecosystem.
Thank you all for sharing your visions, and not just of 2030, but throughout this whole conversation has really been this mixture of what are the hard steps being taken, but also what can we do to take care of ourselves and keep the vision alive, keep movement alive, activism alive. I just want to thank you all for your time, thank all of our viewers for their time, and I hope everyone has been just as inspired as I have been with our 3 incredible activists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellyanne, Xiye, and Ridhima. That was so inspiring to hear. And we will be sure to follow all of your activities as you keep working on your very inspiring climate initiatives. Welcome, everyone. I'm Christina, the great honor of leading. I'm joined here today by Christina Kwauk, who is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute. Christina is one of the world's leading authorities on the connections between girls' education and climate change. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So welcome, Christina. We're so thrilled that you're with us.
Thank you for having me here today.
So let's start with the basics. Let's talk about how climate change impacts girls and girls' education. I mean, I think many people would scratch their heads and say, well, doesn't it affect girls and boys equally? How does climate change affect girls in particular?
Climate change, is pretty indiscriminate when it comes to wreaking its havoc on the planet and on communities. But its impacts often have the strongest effect on the least, skilled, the most vulnerable members of society. And when it comes to, really thinking about, who are the most vulnerable, who are the most marginalized, it tends to be girls and women, and especially girls and women who have done very little in the first place to contribute to our present day emissions and the present day climate crisis. And so when we think about the impact, we have to go back and we have to think about sort of the underlying systems and structures that have created their vulnerabilities. So when we think about some of the immediate impacts, well, some of those immediate impacts are a result of, systemic gender inequalities, gender norms that have kept girls and women away from the spaces in which important information might be passed. And so these kinds of gender constraining norms and spaces disadvantage girls and women in a way that can have life or death consequences. In many cases, women have a much higher mortality rate as a result of climate-related disasters, and can be up as high as 90% in some cases and in some disasters.
I think also when people think about the impacts of climate change, right, often people are thinking about the things that are very visible, right? That there are crops that can't grow, or droughts that happen, or increased flooding, or as you said, weather related, other kinds of extreme weather. But some of the impact is less visible and less obvious. What are some of the invisible effects of climate change, particularly on women and girls?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and the invisible effects, I think, really come out when you think about household coping responses to environmental shocks or slow onset, kind of prolonged climate impacts. And so this is cases where, you know, an environmental shock might create an economic hardship on a family, and they have, you know, even less resources to spread over a family than they might have on a typical, you know, an average sort of year, an average day. And so they're led to make really difficult decisions, you know, and that might mean needing to, you know, marry off a daughter, and that sets a girl off onto, you know, not only early marriage, but early child rearing, withdrawal from school, and just that vicious cycle of, you know, not only marginalization and discrimination, but vulnerability and poverty, and it perpetuates this intergenerational cycle, right? In some cases too, there is, let's say in moments of drought, the, you know, household access to water might be more difficult. And because in most places, you know, women might be the ones responsible for securing household resources like water, this means that, you know, girls would have to be pulled out of school to, you know, spend more time looking for water sources, or, you know, traveling farther distance to collect water. And these things we don't often think about because they are, you know, less visible to us. They're not the crop damage, they're not the destruction of schools that a flood can bring. But these are sort of the reverberating impacts that, you know, we are manifest because of underlying inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just to start. I mean, you can even think, even after a disaster, if, you know, families have to shift to shelters, girls and women will be more susceptible to, you know, sexual assault, sex trafficking, and so on, because they're no longer in the safety of their home. I mean, yeah, those impacts go on just in terms of things that, you know, aren't necessarily on top of mind when you think about climate change, but because of those persisting structures of inequality, just sort of structure their experience of disasters and prolonged climate change and so on.
And one of the things we know that, of course, happens in extreme weather disasters and displacement often is simply disruption to education, right? Even if one could go to school, if there's no possibility because there is no school. What do you think can be done to help safeguard girls' education, even in times of climate emergency? And why is that a priority?
Well, I think COVID has certainly begun to shed some light in terms of how organizations, governments can try to minimize the educational disruptions, and whether that means, you know, replacing school buildings with broadcast, you know, through television or radio, or NGOs unleashing, you know, community workers to ensure that some learning is happening in more informal settings. But then there's also the other side of it, which is to ensure that, you know, communities and family members understand from the get-go the importance of ensuring girls continue to have access to school or education during, you know, during crises and during environmental shocks. Because if they have the importance of education in mind, we could potentially avoid certain circumstances that, you know, when households are, you know, in those moments where they have to make hard decisions, recognize the importance of ensuring their girl child continues to go to school, and recognize the importance of not seeing the dowry as, you know, the solution to a short-term problem.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, you know, if we flip this around and think about how educating girls can mitigate. You've talked about the many things that it can mitigate already and that are more widely known. We know that educating girls increases a woman's ability to earn later, that it improves health, that often girls who are educated marry later, they have healthier children. But it's not as well known that girls' education can help mitigate the effects of climate change. And I think that's so interesting and something that we at Girl Rising are really leaning into. And in fact, we've made a short film to help explain some of these connections. So let's take a quick look at that.
Our planet is reaching a tipping point, and we are running out of time to stop it. Though the problem is global, its effects are unequally spread. Efforts to curb greenhouse gases are hampered by inequities. But there is a powerful strategy for change hiding in plain sight. It addresses the drivers of global warming and its effects. And because it is a fundamental human right, it also confronts injustice. Educating girls is that solution. Its impact is transformative, not only for girls, but for the whole planet. Here's how. Quality education equips girls with skills to prepare their communities for climate emergencies. It provides expertise to build food and water security. And it prepares girls and women to be leaders of communities, movements, and nations. Evidence shows when women have a voice in planning our futures, they create ambitious climate goals and responsible environmental policies. We also know population growth is a major driver of climate change. But when education is accompanied by access to family planning, girls are empowered to choose if and when to have children. Doing this would help avoid 85 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2050. The emerging green economy will rely on skills in science and technology, yet girls are still underrepresented in STEM subjects. Reversing this trend will empower a generation of girls, training them for green jobs that will fast-track us away from reliance on fossil fuels. These benefits are dramatic and decisive, yet our leaders are not putting girls' education on the climate agenda. We all need to understand this connection, and governments must act. Education is a girl's right and our best bet. Join us at girlrising.org/Future Rising.
That was a very succinct description. There's so much underneath so much of what we just heard. So, Christina, I wonder if you could take us a little deeper. Why is girls' education such an important strategy for tackling the effects of climate change?
I like to think about it in three ways. So the first way is really thinking about what an empowering quality education can do for a girl. And that's really, empowering, not only empowering her about, knowledge of the world, knowledge of climate change, knowledge of, basic literacy and whatnot, but more importantly, knowledge about her rights. And, her right as a child, her right as a girl, her right to bodily autonomy, all sorts of things that can really address, those underlying systems of inequality, those underlying structures of inequality that we talked about earlier. So I think when we think about how girls' education can really, empower girls in ways that reduces her vulnerability, increases her adaptive capacity and her resilience. This is, the number one thing that girls' education can do. It also has the side benefit when coupled with addressing the unmet need for family planning to really help us reimagine how, what girls' roles are in their families, in their societies, really help us kind of create the world that we want. Rather than be sort of, thrown into circumstances, especially for marginalized girls where, unplanned pregnancy or unwanted pregnancy can just dramatically alter her life course, in ways that it doesn't necessarily do for boys and men, right? So I think this is a really important thing to just understand how education really has consequential long-term impacts on the girls' lives. We have, great data, great models out there that also suggest that by doing so, we can, potentially avoid 85 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. So it not only, really empowers girls and women, but can have reverberating effects on our climate, on our planet. So that's the first way. And so the second way that I think we have to really begin to think about girls' education and climate change is, skills. A quality, empowering, transformative education provides girls and boys with the necessary skills that are needed, not only for the changing world of the changing world with given climate change, but the changing world of work. And if we see that this changing world of work is going to become a greener, how can we ensure that girls have, a center stage in that green economy? I mean, our present fossil fuel driven economy, we see women at the margins, girls at the margins, especially girls and women in developing countries. If we want to see our economy shift to a green model, to a regenerative model, to a care model, to new economic approaches, how can we expect that to happen if girls and women are not receiving quality and empowering education, but also the skills that are needed to power that transition to a green economy? So I think that's a really critical piece. STEM skills is one part of the picture, but it's not the only part of that green economy. I think we also have to consider, redefining what that green economy is to really include fields like healthcare and education, where women have a very large presence, but we certainly undervalue those sectors in our present economic structures. The third area is around leadership. And this is a piece where, the research really speaks, just when you look at it, you're just like, oh my gosh, there's strong associations between women's representation in parliament, women's political participation, women's political empowerment, and actual green outcomes, pro-environmental outcomes. And this is something that I think, others talk about it as the need for, feminist leadership, and how the climate crisis is really a leadership crisis. I mean, this is really thinking about how women and because of the socialized gender norms, can, come to decision making and positions of power in ways that have benefits for not only themselves, but importantly for their communities and for the environment and for the planet. And so when we look at that and we see that countries with higher representation of women in government have lower carbon footprints, when we see that countries that have addressed these underlying gender inequalities and gender gaps create the structures, the social structures for, better planetary outcomes, as well as better societal outcomes, it's like a no-brainer why we want more women in leadership positions. And girls' education is a really important pathway to women and girls, in leadership positions.
Yeah, and you speak so compellingly about the economy that's coming, right? That's emerging, the new green economy. And we hear world leaders all over talking about it. Very recently, President Biden and John Kerry talking about it as being, the biggest change since the Industrial Revolution. How imminent do you think this global shift is? And can you talk about the scale of change that you think we can expect?
So, there are estimates that, green sector jobs over the next, 10, 20 years could receive hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, creating, tens of millions of new jobs. So, I think it is quite imminent. I think what we need to see is a narrative shift around what industries those are, and ensure that we're talking about industries where women are also present. And then where women aren't present, we're talking about ways to ensure they have the educational and training opportunities to enter into those sectors. So yeah, I think it's now. There have also been, studies projecting, if investments were made in green sector jobs in, for example, countries in Africa, so South Africa in particular, you could see like a 250% growth in jobs if you were to invest in green sector jobs and not fossil fuel jobs, right? And could add like over 200% value add to the economy. And these are, sustainable, renewable jobs. So I think, the prospects are there. I think it's well on our horizon. We need to start talking about who has opportunities and access to those sectors, and which sectors are we talking about? Because that, I think, will make the difference in terms of where the investments go and then who gets those investments.
We just heard our amazing young climate activists all talking about how while they felt like their education equipped them to do what they're doing, they also feel like it was sorely lacking and is for most young people in the world. So how do you think educators to adapt in anticipation of this new world and new economy that you're talking about?
You know, at present, students around the world are having to create their own education around climate change. It's not being offered to them in school. And if it is, it's a tiny portion, 2 hours a year, you know, or it's relegated to extracurriculars or after school clubs, and it's not part of the mainstream education. So a big argument that I have been trying to make is really that we need to reorient the very purpose and foundations of our education systems and reorient that to the greatest existential crisis that we face today, you know? And so by thinking about something like a new green learning agenda, it really requires us to think about new ways of educating children, youth, and adults for climate action.
I also loved how Xiye just spoke about the finding joy, that for young people also, you know, part of this education needs to be about creating the opportunities for young people to find joy in this work, and that those experiences, when possible in nature, really can be completely transformational.
Absolutely. And that's that transformative bit, right? Because I think, at least from what I've seen in the literature and in studies, is that when you can form that connection, that feeling of ownership, that feeling of action, of empowerment, when you address the existential crisis in ways that offer hope and solution, it's very powerful for shifting mindsets in ways that create lasting change, lasting impact, and not just something that, you know, strikes up a curiosity for a moment, and then once you have the other priorities of the day, gets, you know, drowned out by the rest of the noise. You know, it's those transformative moments, that joy piece, the connectivity, the purpose, that really, I think, will drive. I mean, it's presently driving the youth climate movements, right? It's there. And now how do we ensure that our education systems are sort of empowering youth and allowing youth to find that joy in that?
And I certainly think also the really opening up the space for youth activists who are leading the charge, as you said, not only in the work that they're doing and the advocacy that they're doing, but in creating the education that they and others need. Yet another example, I think, of why when youth are provided, when girls and boys are provided with the right kind of skills and education, and are in fact able to use their innate power, that it becomes this self-perpetuating and dynamic force, which, as you said, we're seeing all around the world.
Absolutely. And I think that's the sort of, it's almost like you need a time warp or something to help us speed up that. Because when you think about the level of inaction or the lack of political will that you sort of see in the current political environment, and you see the charged nature of youth activism right now, it's like we need to remember that in a few years' time, these youth will be voters. You know, they will be the ones, you know, driving the change. Let's activate that now, and when we can work together, you know, and not you know, not waste time, you know, doing the political game and, you know, trying to push blame or whatnot at a high political level. Let's activate this enthusiasm and this passion, because we need the change now. Our window of time is closing, and we have the energy and the motivation. We have the innovation. Let's just unleash that.
So what do you think? What can regular people do? What is when you talk to people who are say, okay, but these two things seem really big, educating girls around the world and climate change. What can I do?
So I think number one, we have to talk about it. And number two, one of the proposals that we're proposing, at least in some of our work at the Brookings Institution, is, you know, unleashing the creativity of teachers and students now. Let's see, you know, partnerships with schools that enable climate action projects in every school around the world in 5 years. You know, let's see that happen. I mean, research shows that, you know, the sweet spot for climate action is in the community. It's at the level of about 100,000 people. You can get a couple of neighborhoods and communities together and a couple of, you know, districts of schools working together on this. this can have magnified impact. And if we do this at, across these communities, across the world, we'll have global impact, right? So I think for sure, sort of the call to action here is that we have those conversations, create those partnerships, identify, local impacts and challenges with climate change, and generate those local climate action projects that can leverage community interest, community concern, and really help create spaces for civic engagement. I mean, this is ultimately a project of civic engagement. And how do we do that now, today, with the enthusiasm of, countless number of youth and people around the world. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. And we have put together, for anybody who's listening here, a toolkit to help you talk about this issue. We ask you to go to girlrising.org/futurerising. There's a social media toolkit, the film that you just saw, which is a very easy place to start to share it, talk about it, as Christina said, talk with people in your community, your peers, your colleagues, your teachers, your schools, about what can be done locally. I'm by Ellyanne's story, right? That every one of these big movements starts with a first step. She planted one tree at first. It was an orange tree. She thought it smelled like lemon. Such a beautiful story. And now she's planted over 1 million trees. So these topics do seem huge. It can seem like we can't begin to address them, but it does all start with a first step. And couldn't agree more that talking about it, right? Let's not have a spiraling silence about these issues. So thank you so much, Christina. Thank you for being with us. And thank you all for joining us. I'll also say, please consider supporting Girl Rising. We are building a big initiative around this issue. And there are many other organizations that are working and adapting what they do to make sure they're integrating climate initiatives, climate change into their work. So consider supporting organizations that are doing that, and youth-led organizations that are also at the forefront of so much of this work. So thank you so much for joining us today.